everyone. My name's Aaron Myers, the Everyday Language Learner, and today I'm excited to be joined by Neil Rees. Neil is a student of a lot of languages and also a teacher of language learning and really a specialty in phonetics. He's a father of two. He spent a lot of time living in Spain, is now back in the UK, and I'm excited to have him here with us today. Neil, thanks for being with us.
Good to be here. Glad to be able to participate with you.
Well, that's great. Well, let's begin by having you tell us a little bit about your own language learning journey. When did that begin, and what languages have you been learning, and how's that gone?
Well, my very first language was French, which you learn at school in the UK. And my mum was a French teacher, and we travelled as kids. You know, we went to France and things, and I saw just what language opens up. And there's this strange sort of interest just arose in me. I started teaching myself Welsh when I was 13 because my physics teacher was Welsh, and we used to get extra points in our physics exams for being able to say something in Welsh. So I picked up a Teach Yourself Welsh book from the library and taught myself some Welsh, enough to be able to converse when I was there on holiday one year. Learned German at school as well, and then I did French and German A-levels before going to college. And my own motivation at the time was to earn lots of money very quickly. And so I decided that maybe the best way to do that was to become an interpreter. I seemed to be reasonably good at languages, though I was interested in geeky things like physics as well. But, you know, I decided to go down the language route to earn lots of money as an interpreter in the Strasbourg or the European Parliament or somewhere. So I went and did a languages major in French and German at Bradford University, choosing a course which trained me as an interpreter and translator. And that's where I suppose some of my big shocks came. I remember one day in the French lab, we were asked to record ourselves and then listen to ourselves. And as I listened to my own French being played back, I heard myself speaking French, not with an English accent, but with a Yorkshire accent. You know, I could identify what region of the UK I came from was speaking French. And that totally shocked me because I didn't realize that that's what my accent was like. And I suppose that's part of my own journey in terms of language learning and the sound of language, and trying to develop as much as possible native fluency or native pronunciation. Changed my English pronunciation as well. I found that I've subconsciously now adopt different pronunciations. My family say they always know when I'm on the phone to an American, for example, because I can hear my intonation stuff changes like that. I've developed that subconscious imitation. But that's where it's sort of that interest in language itself was peaked, if you like. Yeah. Then I was living in France the next year. I spent a year overseas working as a translator-interpreter as part of my training. And while I was in Paris, I met up with a family who took me with them to Hungary as an interpreter. They decided that I spoke German and English. They only spoke French, so I'd be able to be a lot more useful than they were in Hungary. So I learned some Hungarian to get by in there. And 3 months swatting up on Hungarian and then on the ground using that. And visits back and forth to Hungary over the years beyond that. My final year at university did a bit of Russian. You know, I just started playing with languages and realizing how much I actually enjoyed language. And I suppose as you learn a bit more about language theory, maybe, you know, one language is hard, two languages is very hard, three, but once you get past that, it's a bit probably like playing a musical instrument. You know, if you can play the piano and a guitar and a trombone, and a xylophone or drums, you know, then people could give you almost any instrument and you start to get a tune out of it quite quickly. So the theory and the practice of all these different languages, they come together and it just becomes fun, really like that. So that's where it came from, I suppose, and grew in that way.
Yeah, that's great. Now, as a lover of language, what led to your transition from kind of a learner to kind of helping others do better at learning languages?
My own transition came, I found myself abandoning my chosen career as an interpreter and going into work with a non-profit. My own life took a turnaround, and I realized that life wasn't just about making as much money as you can, but maybe I should invest in others' lives as well. So I found myself working with a church in that sphere. And as part of that, I was working with people who were going for short-term and longer-term experience into various parts of the world. And just seeing what a mess people made of language learning and how people struggled with what I had found. Well, I did my major in French and German. I learned Hungarian, learned some Russian. And then I moved and found myself living in Spain. And in 3 months, I was happy. I wouldn't say I was totally fluent, but I was happy in Spanish. And yet I met people who've been there 3 years who are still struggling. I thought, what's going on here? Why can't people, just get this? What's so hard about this? And I realized that what I'd done is that through my own study and through my own experience, I'd internalized a series of principles, I suppose, about language learning. And so then when I got involved in developing training for the organization I was working with, I saw the need to put as part of that training equipping people for language learning. Not language teaching in the sense of teaching Spanish or teaching French, but teaching the skills associated with language learning. So I went back and dug out some of the linguistics that I'd studied at university and rehashed stuff into something which was my first attempt at teaching a language learning course. And then from that I worked with a professor at Fuller University with Betty Sue Brewster, who's developed quite a well-known language learning methodology, the LAMP methodology, and I asked her if she would come and help me adapt some of what I've done to provide a more practical training. Mine was more theoretical, really. I remember one of the disastrous parts of it, I developed a language aptitude test where I used Russian to test people, how I thought people would do in language. It was quite accurate in some ways, but it was terribly demoralizing for those whose score was low. So I quickly abandoned that. But so I've learned a few things on that. So with Betty Sue Brewster, she came over and helped me working through the way she would run a course like that to adapt what I've done to have, I suppose, a map, if you like, of the terrain, which is what I think linguistics is. It's explaining to people, like if you're going to be going to Burma, get a rough guide to Burma out of the library and start reading it through. Familiarize yourself with it before you're there. But then also the practical elements of working actually with other languages.
Yeah. That map idea really resonates with me. That's kind of what I've talked to people about, is it feels like when people decide to move to another country, there's this, as far as language goes, this just huge blank map that there's no routes, there's no roads, and they're like, where do I go? And the training and the preparation is helping to really start to put on the details of that map so that when they get into it, now they kind of have a path open up before them that they recognize and can follow. And I feel like that's the thing that I work to do, is to really give some of those details to empower people. And so that's really excited to hear you talk about it in that sense.
That's why I think the kind of stuff you do, familiarizing people with the concept of language itself and playing with language, is actually almost as good as to prepare you as delving into the specific language itself. In the UK, our organization has its headquarters in Wales, and people say, I'm going to be going and living in France. Should I go to night school and learn French? And I say, no, learn Welsh. And they look at you really sort of quizzically. Why on earth would I want to learn Welsh if I'm going to France? I say, well, at night school, you might do 2 hours a week. You're going to be there for 30 weeks. That's 60 hours tuition you'll get. How much are you really going to learn in 60 hours? And how much are you going to learn badly? Why not instead invest in understanding the methods, invest in your own concept of language learning, in your own confidence in the language learning process, in phonetic skills, in pronunciation skills, in language learning in and through the community. Build those skills into yourself. Because to be honest, 60 hours tuition, well, that's 2 weeks living in a country. So familiarize yourself with the whole field of language learning rather than just sort of try and learn a bit of that language. And that really does help people. Reading the kind of stuff you have on your blog. For example, I was just finished teaching a course last week, and part of the task people had was to research what's available on the internet these days in terms of language learning blogs, simply to give people that kind of background. Which, although you don't see its immediate relevance, it's that familiarity, it's that creating that map of the terrain, which then when you get into the language learning process really does help a lot.
Yeah. Now, when you've been teaching these courses on kind of helping people step into this new life of a self-directed, independent language learner, what's kind of one of the biggest hurdles you find that you need to help those students, those learners overcome?
Fear. Fear, or it's the AA program says that's F everything and run. I won't use the F word, I'm being recorded, but that's what fear does. It paralyzes a person and causes them to want to run in the opposite direction, rather than face everything and rise, which is what you actually need to do. And so the lack of confidence in most people towards language learning, most people's experience has been negative. they've learnt language at school, except they haven't. They've studied, and they've done 5 years at school, then been placed face to face with the native speaker of that language and not been able to communicate anything. And that creates a huge lack of confidence in people.
Yeah.
So that the fear of going into a situation, the fear of failure, the fear of embarrassment, which paralyzes people into inaction, that's one of the biggest things. And another one is simply people just don't know what to do.
Yeah.
You know, it's if I say ignorance, it's like you say, you arrive and you have this great big panorama ahead of you, and you stand there thinking, what on earth do I do now? Because most people aren't trained as learners. They're trained as students, or trained as people who are taught. And so the only way you can learn a language is because someone teaches you a language. And if you can't find a decent language school, then how on earth are you going to learn? You know, for learners of English, there's so much work being done on English. Masses and masses of brilliant materials available in English, resources, excellently trained teachers. But you go and somewhere else where you want to learn something different, and you find the teachers aren't trained in good methodology, there aren't the resources available, there's no good coursework stuff there, and you just face to face with that. A lot of people just say, I just don't know what to do, don't know how to get past this.
Yeah.
You know, you learn how to say hello, I need some bread. Now what do I do?
Yeah. No, that resonates with me. That the lack of know-how is a huge one.
And people don't seem to want to take the time to acquire that know-how. They want to get stuck in and go and do it. And I say, look, you know, do a 2-week course, do a month's course, find something which creates that language awareness. Work on your phonetic skills, because that is a shortcut. If you're going overseas somewhere for 2 months, it's not worth it maybe. But if you're planning to spend 3 years in a place, then an investment of 2 weeks of your life to understand more of the language learning process really is a shortcut to success.
Yeah.
And it prevents the kind of failure which brings a lot of people home, because they just can't hack it after you've been there 3 years and you think, oh, I just can't do this.
Yeah.
People do suffer.
Following up on that, what are some surprising insights you've discovered as you've worked with people to help them, step into this role?
I think one of the biggest surprises for me has come in seeing how afraid some people are of it all. This might sound stupid, but the place of fear and the place of emotional motivation. When people are stressed, they don't learn well. And so if people are surrounded by this fear of language learning, and this fear of failure, the fear of public ridicule, people are often quite happy to try their new language out. But if I'm there, and there's someone there who speaks better than me, but is also a learner, then I clam up because I somehow feel embarrassed in front of them.
Yeah.
And so that whole emotional, the place of emotion in language learning, that it's not simply about intellect. There's so much more involved in that. And so helping people to say, well, what you need to overcome is that. And you need to enjoy language learning. You have to learn to laugh at yourself.
Yeah.
You have to be able to stand back. One of the first things I said, I was asked to speak in a church in Spain, and I'd been there probably 3 months. And I spoke about St. Paul, who traveled around the Mediterranean world melting churches. That he had a special gift for destroying churches, as I used the wrong Spanish word. And you can see people starting to laugh a little bit at what I'm saying. You think, oh, well, let's go with this. Because you've got to learn to laugh with it.
Yeah.
Mistakes, you have to be able to take mistakes as a platform to success. It's like, is it a ceiling which prevents you going any further, or is the ceiling actually a floor to build the next story on?
Yeah.
And so when mistakes are something you embrace as part of your learning journey rather than an embarrassment,
Well,
then that's something. I think something else which is a real insight I've taken away from this is how much, once people get into their head what self-directed, or sometimes I prefer to talk about learning in the community is about, is that then language learning is no longer a barrier to relationship building, but language learning actually becomes a key tool for relationship building. And so you find that many of your best friendships that you form in a new community are formed precisely because you are vulnerable and a language learner who needs their help. And so when you're able to take on that role and change a bit, I'm no longer a strong, independent Westerner who's come in here, but I'm simply someone who's got to start learning from scratch. And You realize that they are the people who are going to help you. Then some excellent bonds are formed in that. And most people are able to do this. They find a much more fulfilling experience of the community and of the country and of the culture than people who are learning at a distance.
Yeah.
Because self-directed doesn't mean you go and get the books out of the library yourself. Self-directed means you take charge of your learning, but then you're rooting that learning in, particularly in contacts with people, and allowing them to be your teachers, if you like.
Yeah.
So that's one of the other things. The language learning isn't a barrier to finding friendships and belonging in a community and really enjoying your learning experience. On the contrary, the learning experience itself is part of the journey. Yeah,
that's really that idea of kind of flipping that dynamic on its head. Of so often, as a Westerner, we just by the fact that we're Westerners often come to places in a kind of a position of power or prestige or something. And it does. It flip you. It's like it's humbling. Like, I'm a learner. I need your help, and I think that can be a hard one for people to kind of step into.
It is.
But it's such a good thing to step into for our own. Not only for language, but just as character development, as growing as people, and learning to.
It feels risky.
But
it's making yourself vulnerable. I found has been one of the most helpful things in terms of achieving my goals of language learning. It's really people take you under their wing. You'll always find someone who wants to mother you, that kind of thing. And that has been, hugely productive in terms of language learning for myself.
Now, you also specialize in phonetics. So what is phonetics, and why is it important for language learners?
Okay, well, phonetics really is looking simply at how sounds are produced in your mouth. So it's a physical description of what you do with this vocal apparatus that we have, which enables us then to speak. Phonetics is a branch, you might say, of phonology, which is the whole thing of how sounds are put together. Phonetics are the individual specific sounds. So if you have a word like pin in English, that's made up of 3 specific sounds, a p, an I, and an n. And so phonetics describes those sounds. And then I say the area of phonology works on how you put it together. And the reason it's important is when a baby's born, a baby has an infinite capacity for language. You take a baby born in China and bring them up in the States, and they'll speak perfect American but will not be able to get the tones, because it's not something which is inherent. Language is part of culture, which is transmitted from one generation to another, and it is learned behavior. So a baby has all this potential in their mouth. And then over the course of the years that a baby grows to a child and is learning language, sounds are fixed. The important sounds in the language of that area where the person lives are fixed in that child's mouth, and everything else then gets ignored. And it's not just our mouth, but our brain. Our brain learns to analyze the sounds that are important for us, and we miss absolutely everything else. We only focus on that information which is important for us. Now, when you're going to learn another language, we don't realize that they've grown up with a different set of sounds and a different set of language concepts, different things which are important for them. And so totally subconsciously, what we do is we impose on the language, both as we're listening and as we're speaking, the set of sounds which we have acquired. And they might not be quite the same, or they might be very, very different. And we tend to approximate. So when we're hearing a French person speak, for example, and so the French person is speaking like this, we can tell that they do not have the same sounds as we have. And so we hear this r sound that the French people do. And we think, I can't do that. So we don't say Paris, we say Paris, because it's the next best thing for us. And so we're approximating all the time with those sounds. Now, what a study of phonetics does, it allows you as an adult learner to use your brain in a way that it analyzes what's going on in your mouth, what's going on with the physical production of the sounds, and helps you, therefore, to say, with that analytical capacity that you have as an adult, to force your tongue and your mouth to do what you're not quite sure it's supposed to do because you don't really quite hear things properly. Yeah. So, again, the example of French, you might hear there's a difference between tu and tu. And tu, tu, But we don't have those sounds in English. We only have an oo sound. And so many learners of French will just approximate. Je parle français, tu parles anglais? And so you're getting the wrong sound. But when through phonetics, someone can explain to you, or you can read the information, this is how that sound is produced. You go, so one is an oo, like an English oo, but the other one isn't. The other's different. The other one is like saying an e, but now make your lips the same shape as an oo, but don't move your tongue. So you go e, u, u, not u, not oo, u. And so you're using mental processes to feed information, which enables you then to imitate the pronunciation which you're not hearing properly. There. Now, with French, there are obviously many similarities between the sounds, with English, both Indo-European languages. But it's when you come to other languages, let's say you are dealing with an Asian language, if you're dealing with Korean or Chinese, or if you're dealing with Hindi or Urdu, then you find some major differences, and this is where the fun really starts, in terms of using what we call comparative phonetics, where you analyze or you find a description of the sounds as they're spoken in that language, the sounds as we have them in my language, and you start to compare the differences. Because sometimes there are things that we don't realize we're doing, which affect the way we speak our language. And yet if we apply those same things to another language, then we can cause some real hilarity. And we just don't hear them. Because I say, as a baby, you've been trained to only recognize the sounds that are important for you.
Right.
And if another language has different sounds which are important for them, then we simply don't hear them.
Right.
And that's where the phonetic description can come along and tell you, well, actually, this is something else. And say, I haven't noticed that. Saying, well, no, you wouldn't. Yeah. And then you can start to pay closer attention, start to hear the sounds, and then start to imitate those sounds yourself. So that's what phonetics does. It's particularly for adult learners. To make up for the lack that we have, as kids learn and just absorb accents in a very natural way, which as adult learners we lose that capacity.
So in a lot of ways, it's about teaching yourself to notice those differences. It's recognizing, as I say, the limitations we have as adult learners because we've internalized a language. And obviously most people, language learning is something you do as part of your growth and your absorbing of the culture around you. So by the time you get to 13, 14, you've learned the languages you're going to use. And so rather than have a part of your brain which is idle, sitting there doing nothing, well, that then seems to transfer its capacity to an analytical capacity. And we lose the capacity to learn in childlike ways. This is why some of these language learning programs you may have seen, learn Italian in 3 weeks with no effort. Learn as a child. Well, yeah, okay, up to a certain point, but we can't actually learn the way children do because we've lost some of that ability. And as an adult, we have an analytical capacity which can help us do so much better in some ways than kids do. Right.
So it's feeding into that and helping us create the sounds and hear the sounds which otherwise we wouldn't know are there.
Right. Yeah. So this is a thing I think, answer this. So I'm talking to people and they're like, well, what's wrong with approximating? They understand what I'm saying. It's good enough.
Yeah, it's good enough, but good enough what for? And I think that is always a question of language learning. I put together an infographic looking at how long it takes to learn a language. And the question always is, well, what level do you want to get to? Because, if I want to go and tour Russia. I was in China 2 years ago, and my Chinese isn't great. But I found myself, much to my surprise, having to speak Chinese everywhere because I couldn't find anyone who spoke English. In Beijing, there were a few people, but otherwise it was buy your train ticket in Chinese and order your meal in Chinese and find your hotel in Chinese and speak to the taxi driver in Chinese. And, I was way out of my depth. But I had enough. I could do it. My family were impressed. That's important. But
right.
I could
impress
do
those
it.
Teenagers.
Yeah. I survived. And so survival, Chinese is okay. And I knew I was murdering the grammar. My pronunciation, that's one of the things I'm, probably better at because I've worked on phonetic skills. But, I sounded pretty ropey. But I survived. If that's all you need, well, yeah, okay, why bother? They can understand you. You can understand them. You're going to be there 2 weeks or a month. Then you're going off to your next country. Well, you probably don't need to worry too much. But if what you're wanting to do is to integrate better with people, and you're wanting to spend a year of your life or 3 years or retire to a country or move there or whatever, or simply be able to relate to people in a way which they're not always talking to the dumb foreigner. You know, Tarzan speak is okay. You can buy yourself an ice cream and they can tell you how much it cost. They can point you to the way to the toilets and the restaurant and the things, but you won't really engage with people like that. And you'll never be able to include it in natural conversation. So it's really deciding what level you want to learn a language to. And for myself, I find that I always want to be as integrated as I can. I want to be as like them as I can, because that brings the barriers down.
Yeah.
If I'm always speaking with a heavy accent, which means they have to be stopping and struggling to actually understand what I'm saying, then I'm never going to get that kind of natural dialogue, which I'd like to as part of my own experience of a culture.
Yeah.
So that's why I would say I think it's important. You don't need native pronunciation. And I think very few people being realistic will ever achieve that. The kind of test where you put someone behind a screen or give them a recording and say, is this a foreigner or is this a native speaker? We don't need that level of pronunciation ability. But you do want to have an approximation of the sounds so that people aren't struggling all the time to asking you to repeat what you're saying. You want to be clear in what you're saying. Your accent mustn't grate on them in a way which makes listening to you difficult. And so that's what I think you need to try and achieve.
Yeah. I had my wife, her mother's Bolivian, and her niece, my wife's cousin, came up to the States, and her name is Erica, and so it's Erica, but all the American friends called her Erica. Yeah. And I remember once realizing, like, when I was hearing what I was hearing when she'd say her own name was Edica, like with a D.
Yeah.
And
precisely.
As I was familiarized with the phonetic representation of what these sounds are, I realized, well, no, this isn't a D, and it's not RR, it's this other R. And I was talking to her about it, and she just talked about how it was just like she doesn't like to hear Americans say her name because they're just like Erica, and her name's not Erica, it's Edica. And I think
my daughter's the same. Sorry.
No, go on.
We've just moved back to the UK, and my daughter was born and brought up in Spain, and her name is Laura, which is the same spelling as the English name Laura, but all her friends will call her Laura, and she still finds it difficult. Laura, it is different. But what you said there, you heard she was saying Erica, and you heard it as with a D. Yeah. That's what happens because our phonetic training has trained us to hear things in a certain way. And so you will hear that sound, and if you are reproducing that without any phonetic understanding, you may even say it as a D. And depending on what other sounds they have in that language, that may be confusing for them.
Yeah.
So that's what phonetics tries to deal with. But the training I was doing 2 weeks ago, I had a bilingual group of Koreans and English speakers, and we had great fun with the Koreans. I got first of all, I got one of the English speakers out, and I wrote some words on the board and said, "Would you read these words, please?" So it was top and stop, car and scar, pin and spin. And I pointed to the letter P in those letters, and I said, pin and spin, are they the same sound? Pin, spin. Yeah, same sound. Because no, different sound, different letter. So, okay, could you write that in Korean? And they wrote that with a different letter in Korean.
Yeah.
And then I wrote some Korean words on the board. A word for rice, pabo. And so I said to the Koreans, okay, pabo, is that the same sound? And they say, yeah, same sound, pabo, same sound. And the English speakers, no, different sounds. And so we had great fun then looking at why that happens, and how within a language you don't hear the differences that are there.
Right.
Those differences are very real, but you've somehow filtered them out.
Yeah.
And so you don't hear them in the other language.
Right.
And this is where phonetics helps, specifically with those, for example, if I were to say that pit is an aspirated sound, which means that you've got a strong puff of air coming out. If you've got a microphone there, it picks that up, pit. But when we put an S in front and say spit, it's no longer aspirate. So it's spit. You don't have that puff of air coming out. Now, in English, p and p, it doesn't matter. I can say pit and I can say spit. It just sounds funny, but it doesn't change the meaning.
Right.
Whereas in Korean, if I say pit or pit, those are actually two different words. that changes the meaning. And so that's why there's so much confusion. That's why also, you know, sometimes we laugh at the Asians' use of l and r. So fried rice, you want fried rice? That's simply because, again, in Korean, for example, the same letter will be pronounced as a l or as a r, depending on where it is in a word.
Right.
And so for them, they're the same sound, written with the same letter, and they cannot understand how we can tell the difference between lice and rice, or race and lace. You know, it just doesn't make sense to them at all.
Right.
The same as we don't understand the difference between pa and pa. You know, it's there.
Right.
But that's that. It's getting a little bit technical here, but that's
but I think
illustrating the kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think those are really good examples because one is that we aren't as Americans, I don't know what the majority of people aren't learning Asian languages or languages that have a lot of really different sounds. I think when we go to that, and I think more are learning Chinese and Arabic.
Mandarin Chinese is becoming a lot more popular.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for people to realize, like, are these subtle differences that we might not hear, but that are really important. It's not just about having a gringo accent.
No.
It's about actual meaning in a lot of these things.
It is. And at early stages of language learning, when all you're saying is, you know, how much is the ice cream, you're standing in front of an ice cream vendor's stall and saying, how much ice cream? You know, there's not a lot of confusion that can happen.
Right.
But as you're developing language ability and context becomes much more important in terms of linguistic context rather than simply physical context, then there's much more room for confusion and misunderstanding in what you say. And
question then, as a language learner, when should we begin working at, you know, I think of like pronunciation, phonetics training as in some ways outside of comprehension and meaning. As far as it's about training this apparatus to figure out these new sounds. When should we start working on those? Like right away? Before we even start learning, you know?
Day one. You can do training on your phonetic skills before you even know which language that you're going to learn. And particularly, I would say, language phonetic awareness, to become aware of your own pronunciation habits. And so, for example, you mentioned, you know, the Erica, the R sound is very characteristic of American English. It's used in UK English as well, not quite as ubiquitously, but be aware that that's what you do. So when you say a word like, I say car, and you say car, there's this at the end there. Yeah. And so whenever you meet a word in a foreign language which ends in a r, so say you're learning Spanish, amar, querer, you know, which is totally foreign to a Spanish pronunciation. When you become aware of those habits, then you can start to eradicate them more easily when you move into another language. Right. So that's something you can do before you're learning any language.
Right.
But then when you're actually moving into the language that you're learning, pronunciation has to be your number one goal from the beginning. In a sense, language is made up of three areas. This is a bit broad, but you know it's valid. You've got pronunciation, you've got structure, and you've got vocabulary. So you've got to know the words, you've got to know how to say the words, you've got to know how to put the words together. I mean, that's a bit broad generalization. Yeah. When you're starting, you don't have any vocabulary, and you haven't got a clue about structure. But pronunciation is something you can work on from day one. Particularly if you're doing a language learning in and through the community approach, where you're surrounded by speakers of a language, then you can be doing a lot of intensive listening to sounds. And listening has to come first, before production. You have to learn to identify the sounds and to hear the sounds before you're starting to work on producing those. And within that, I'll just mention one thing which is slightly separate from phonetics, but within the whole area of phonology, that's intonation. Intonation is the natural sing-song of language, you know, as it goes up and down. And intonation follows very regular patterns in language. So in English, for example, questions may rise towards the end if you're expecting a yes-no answer. There's different patterns which are there. But those intonation patterns are not transferable between languages. Right. Intonation is one of the first things that a child learns. If you listen to a baby as they start to play with their vocal operators. They're playing with the language. And even when they can't put a sentence together, they can use the intonation. So a child, for example, if you give a child a chocolate bar, they might say something like, chocolate mine? Which is a question. They're asking, is this chocolate mine?
Yeah.
Or they may grab it from you and say, chocolate mine. And so it's an affirmation. And they've picked up that kind of intonation just very naturally from their interaction with people.
Right.
Now, this is something we have to try and gain early on in language. And when you can't understand a thing, one thing you can start to do is identify the intonation patterns. And one of the best ways of doing this is through a method which is called tracking, which is don't do it in a situation where you need to engage intelligently in any kind of relationship. But tracking is where you simply follow in your own head, or even speaking out loud, the rhythm and the feel of the language that a person has. If you're able to get a helper or a friend to do some recording for you, and again, this is very useful in the early days of language learning. It can be a bit difficult working with real people because you're asking them to repeat all the time. One of the sentences I learned when I was learning some Urdu was, "Main aapki Urdu zaban seekhna chahta hoon," which means I would like to learn your Urdu language. Now, if I got someone to repeat that to me, he'd be saying that 500 times and getting very bored. So I get a recording of that, and then I can play that recording over, and I can be hearing that and allowing the sound of that language to flow over me. And it starts to create new patterns in your mind. So you say you're tracking that, you're going over that, and allowing yourself to develop that new intonation. And that's almost even before you start to focus on some of the individual sounds. As you do that, as you spend a lot of time listening to the language, you'll find that some of these sounds start to stick out to you. Right. So if you're learning Arabic, you'll hear all these and sounds deep down your throat. And what on earth are all these? And that begins to give you clues as to the sounds that you need to be concentrating on. And then the next step is to get hold of some phonetic information, if that's available. And a lot is there. Wikipedia is not 100% accurate, but it's pretty good, really, in terms of what's available. And use that information to see the different sounds there are in that language and how they contrast with your own. And then that gives you an idea of the kind of sounds you need to be working on. Mm-hmm. And once you've got that, and sounds, English is made up of 44 or 45 sounds. The language you're learning may have 35, 38. How many are different to English? 17 sounds are different. Okay. Well, concentrate on one sound for a week. Yeah. Spend your whole week concentrating on that sound. You've done the lot in 17 weeks. Yeah. So take one of these sounds and spend a week practicing it. Ask a friend to write you down 50 words with that sound contained in it. And which gives you then the chance to practice those or to record those so you can listen to them and work on that until you find yourself building up that capacity with that sound. You don't need to worry at this stage too much about meaning. You obviously are learning meaning at the same time, but if you don't correct pronunciation early on, then you'll find that you learn incorrectly. Let's give a little illustration about this. If you get a plate of Jell-O, so you've got your Jell-O there, and you get a jug of hot water, or water, for the American listeners, and you pour that on the top. Then it flows down the side, and immediately you've got a set of grooves down the side of your Jell-O. Now take some more water and pour it on the top. What happens? It goes straight down the grooves. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens in our mouth and brain to mouth coordination. That your brain starts to wear these grooves into the way you say things. And if you're learning a foreign language, if you learn too much of a foreign language with wrong pronunciation, then you've worn incorrect grooves into the Jell-O of your brain. And correcting that later on is then actually quite difficult. It's much easier to work at it from the beginning and to develop a better pronunciation from the beginning than it is, say, a year or 18 months into language learning, than to correct what's been learned incorrectly. Right. It involves breaking something and refocusing, and that's a lot harder. So I would always say, particularly if you're living out in a country and learning on site, spend the first 3 months with a very, very strong focus on pronunciation skills. Absorb as much as you can of the pronunciation of the language without worrying too much about the rest of your competence, which will develop alongside that. Right. And put a lot of effort into pronunciation. And even the language that you are learning, learn a little and use it a lot. And get your language up to fluency right from the beginning. Trying to sound as authentic as you can right from the beginning. Now, there's one other thing I might just mention this, which is horrible. And I say this to every learner that I speak to, and I think 95% choose to ignore it. But I found that it really is the only way I've found for people to really correct pronunciation. This is record yourself. Children seem to have this ability to naturally monitor what they're saying, and so take a 5-year-old kid and move from let's say from Boston or New York down to Alabama. Put them in a school in Alabama, and what's happened within 2 months to that kid's pronunciation? They have just totally absorbed a local accent.
Right.
The parents won't have. The parents will be defending their identity, but the kids will have just absorbed like that an accent. A child still has that capacity to convert audio input into oral output and make the two sound the same. Lots of reasons for that, but anyway, they have that ability. We don't have that. And so you hear someone saying something, and then we speak it out, and we think we're saying the same. And this is one of the things which can be very frustrating when you're working with a language helper. You say cough. You say cough. He says, no, cough. So you say cough. He says, no, cough. You say cough. He says, no, cough. What on earth? You can't begin to hear what he's saying and what I'm not saying. And it can be very, very frustrating. But try recording yourself. Listen to yourself side by side with a native speaker. Get them to record a sentence and then record yourself next to it. And that picks out the differences in a way which is frightening. None of us like the sound of our own voice recorded. It's just... But I'm sorry, that's the way you sound to other people, so get used to it, deal with it. But in terms of improving phonetic skills, this is one of the absolute keys. In the early days of language learning, record yourself, compare yourself with a native speaker, identify the differences, and then work strongly on those. Yeah.
No, that's really good. And something I did a lot of in learning Turkish and was just that, and I think you're right. I encourage people to record, and it's like nobody seems to really take it seriously, but it is really quite amazing to hear, Mehmet, my language helper, say a word and then me repeat it, or a sentence, and realize, oh yeah, there's the difference. I can isolate it. I've noticed it, and then now I can start to work on it. And I remember as a kid, I used to watch a cartoon, G.I. Joe, and the catchphrase or the motto at the end was always, knowing is half the battle. And I just think it's when you know the difference, when you can notice and see it, then you can actually begin to work on it and create some drills or activities that can help focus on it. What are some things that, I think, well, I'll start by summarizing. So at the beginning, people should listen massively to the language, just to hear it.
It's very important to get oral input, because otherwise, if you're simply working from a textbook, then unwittingly you impose on the way that language is written the significant sounds for you that you've grown up with. You don't hear it. When you're reading and you're speaking it back inside your head, you're speaking it back as you would say it. And so for the first 3 months, make written input as little as possible, and work intensively with oral input. And that's where recordings can be helpful. As I say, those you can get a bit of a pain for people if you're trying to, you can't say very much. But intensive oral input will help shape your mind to these new sounds, put new grooves in the jello. To put those grooves in the right place and help you to do that. And then once those sounds are ingrained within you, take Turkish. The letter I that is written without a dot on the top. A new English person comes to that, and it sounds a bit different, but not quite sure what it is. Let's just say it as an eh. That'll do. What does it matter? When it is a completely different sound. And so if you work with that sound beforehand, once that's established within you, then you can read it, and the writing will connect with that new sound. But if you work from written stuff too early, then you really won't get that sound properly.
And I think that's such an important piece of doing some of that homework of going to Wikipedia and printing off the phonetic charts of your native language and also the target language, and being able to kind of overlay those and say, these are close, but it's not quite. But I think with that, there is a little bit of homework to do to just understand, like, what is that, the vowel chart? How does that work? What is a front vowel or a back vowel, high or low, and puckered or unpuckered? And to be able to, it takes a little bit of work to understand all that, but it's so important to be able to actually use those then.
That's why the preparation is vital. It's not just about the language itself, but it's understanding the whole field of language and how language works. And so one of the things I try and achieve in the training that I do is for people to be able to access reference material and understand it. They don't have to know and be able to tell me, okay, this is a high back unrounded vowel. Come on, what is it? They don't have to be able to do that. But they do have to be able to consult that information and understand when it says this sound is inaspirate, or this is not voiced, or this is a palatal sound. Oh, we don't have any palatal sounds in English. Wonder what that might look like, And that does require a little bit of work beforehand. But the dividends for that are just huge, because it does enable you to engage your mind with the process in a way which, say, the simple language learning capacity as a child isn't there anymore, but the analytical capacity is. Yeah. So to engage that in intelligent ways really does boost your language learning.
Yeah. Now, do you have a drill or activity that you could share with us that would be a good, if you were going to add one tool to the toolbox in order for people to help move closer to that native-like pronunciation?
That drill is a very generic one, but I would say it's working on the whole thing of minimal pairs. Mm-hmm. Now, a minimal pair is where you take two words where the only difference between them is one sound. So if I take, for example, in English, pin and bin, I've changed the initial sound from a p to a b, and that changes the meaning of the word. So we can say those two words are a minimal pair. Yeah. And those minimal pairs help you to isolate the different sounds that are there. And so what you need to do in terms of phonetic or pronunciation practice is working with someone in the language or finding online resources, is get lists of words of minimal pairs with sounds which are difficult for you or sound to distinguish, or sounds which are difficult for you to produce, and so you tend to produce one which is a different one instead. So I did some retraining of English teachers in Spain, and I produced a website for them, and part of the resources on that was whole just buckets of minimal pairs, working, for example, between s and z, which is a difference which doesn't exist in the same way in Spanish. So c, z, sit, zit, sap, zap, race, raise, the s and z sounds. Yeah. So you identify lists of these minimal pairs, get a native speaker to record these for you so you can work on the hearing of that difference, and then work on production of that. Ways to do that with a language helper would be to ask him to, at random, say from column A or column B, and you have to identify which one it is there. And then once you're quite familiar with listening and identifying, then to try the production. And so now it's your turn on column A or column B, and he has to try and tell you which one you're saying until you're developing that ability to distinguish between the sounds. Yeah. Minimal pairs, differentiation in that way, through contrast, is a fantastic way to learn some of the sounds like that. Yeah. So that's the one thing I'd say, minimal pairs as a way to drill some of these sounds.
No, that's a good one. I wrote there's an article on the site called Stumbling Out of Bad Pronunciation, and minimal pairs is one of the activities that I share about, so I'll make sure and link to that. People can look at it and learn a little bit more about it, because I think there are so many things you can do. And like for me, when I was learning Turkish, in some ways I used I would spend 2 hours with a language helper, and I would use kind of 15-minute slots to really work on pronunciation. And not only did it just help me to kind of train that new muscle memory, but it also kind of gave my mind a break from the hard work of comprehension. And so
having to put all these agglutinative words together in Turkish.
Yeah. And so I'd work on some stuff until I was like, okay, I'm starting to feel fuzzy now. And then I'd do pronunciation practice, and I would, in some ways, just say, I'm going to kind of shut my mind down and really just work on sounds. And I would kind of have to almost tell myself beforehand, I'm not going to worry about meaning during this specific time. Absolutely. I'm just going to work on creating sound and working on that. And so that's really good. And this is, I feel like pronunciation and that idea of getting closer to, you talked about the three, sounds, structure, and vocabulary. And in general, everyone understands we need to focus on structure and vocabulary. But I feel like a lot of times people do kind of write off, well, if I can get it out there and I can communicate, then I'm good. And
they also think it will come naturally as you work on the other two.
Yeah.
And you think, well, if I can't say anything, then how am I going to work on sounds? Because I can't say anything yet. So, what's the point of working on sounds? But it does need to be the opposite way. You have to work and get that strong foundation in the understanding and then the capacity in the sounds, which you then put into the content as you learn to produce content.
Yeah.
It doesn't just happen naturally. Naturally, what you do is you impose your own filter, your own grid that you already have.
Right.
That's the natural process.
Yeah. That's all really good. So last question I want to ask you, I want to ask everybody is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a beginning language learner? Say, 26-year-old had 2 years of high school French or 3 years and was frustrated and now has decided, I really want to learn whatever the language is. What would the one piece of advice that you'd give to them be?
Well, other than just go for it, which is there, I would say I think you learn by doing. So don't try and learn to swim by lying on your kitchen table and practicing the strokes from a book. Get in the water, move around, get someone to coach you, feel it, experience it. That's the only way you'll do it. And so with language learning, I think we've been so trained to study a language rather than to learn a language that we're comfortable in that, and we find it easy to sit in a classroom with a textbook writing exercises, and then we're placed in front of a real person, and we just don't know what to do. So forget that approach. You're not studying about a language, you're learning a language, and learning a language is designed for social communication. Language is not the end. The aim, or the end, if you like, is social relationship, and language is the tool for that. And if you take language out of that context and make it into an academic pursuit, you can learn Latin or Greek and read Hierophontes and Cicero and all these things if you like, but really language learning is about learning to communicate with other people. So put your language learning back into that context, right from the word go, and refuse to learn more than you can use. So don't study, so much that you have a head full of knowledge which you can't translate into action. Okay. Make sure that your ability to use the language keeps up with what you're absorbing. Yeah. And I think that's one of the great advantages we have these days with internet stuff, is that you don't have to be living in France to do this with French. You go onto mylanguageexchange.com or to buso.com or LiveMotch, any one of these sites. And particularly if you're a native English speaker, you will always find someone who's prepared to do an exchange class with you. Yeah. And so you can spend 2 hours a week quite happily talking in French with someone. Yeah. And you don't need to be living in the country itself. But don't miss out that step. Don't make language learning into language studying about language. Get out there and use it, and make sure you use what you're learning. Yeah,
that's really great. I always give the example to people, like when I met my wife, I didn't start by giving her a personality test and an IQ test, and I started by spending time with her. Those things, we did there's a book, 5 Love Languages, and a few years ago we read through that and was like, oh, this was instructive and helpful. But it wasn't the place to start. It was the place to come to kind of fill in some gaps, and so that's really great. I
say the same. It's like a map. You can study a map with all the contours and the trees marked and the rivers and everything else, but there's nothing like walking the terrain. The map's useful, but you have to be walking it, really.
Well, Neil, this has been fantastic. I feel like there's just a whole lot of great takeaways for everyone in this, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it. It's been fun.
All right. Great.
Thank you.